Welcome to the second series of By Design. My name is Bruce Boucher and I'm director of Sir John Soane's museum. Soane's idea for his museum was to be an academy of the arts where art, architecture and design could be discussed, explored and celebrated. It's with this in mind that we have collaborated with Luke Irwin, the distinguished rug designer, who feels passionately about the role of design and whose support has been fundamental to this series. Chaired by Alice Rawsthorne, design writer and critic, and Will Gompertz, artistic director at the Barbican, these talks explore the impact of design on several internationally renowned designers. And you can find podcasts of the first series on our website, soane.org. For this second series, we invited Dan Pearson, Ilse Crawford, Erdem Moraliolu, Amanda Levitt, and Phyllida Barlow to present an object that has inspired them, and through that object to reflect on their own design practice. We originally launched the second series in February 2020 with Alice Rawsthorne talking to the designer Dan Pearson at the Soane, and we're pleased to present the remaining talks through a series of individual events filmed at the museum. Thanks to our collaboration with Luke Irwin, we are not charging for these talks, but it would be wonderful if you would consider making a contribution, which would enable us to continue our wider learning programs. And you can do so on soane.org. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Welcome to the Sir John Soane Museum. I'm sitting in the library and dining room, which is an amazing space, pretty much alone, a couple of camera people, a producer, and most importantly, our guest for this episode of By Design. She's a sculptor of world renown who really only came to public attention after she retired from teaching after 20 years of which were at the Slade School. That was in 2009. Since then, she's been represented by one of the biggest art galleries in the world. She had a huge show at Tate Britain in the Devine Galleries and was selected in 2017 to represent Britain at the Venice Biennale. She is, of course, you'll have guessed by now, Phyllida Barlow. Phyllida, welcome to By Design. Welcome to the Sir John Soane Museum. The first thing you've got to do is a job, which is to select an object in this wonderful treasure trove of a place that means something specifically to you.
I think the physical encounter here, where the little passageways are so narrow, and you sometimes think it's a cul-de-sac, but it isn't. It's exactly what my relationship with sculpture has always been, that the walking around it, the physical encounter of this object in front of you, for me, it isn't just the image. It's the actual presence of that materiality and physical thing. And sometimes maybe I've got part of my brain is missing or something. I can't actually remember the image of some of the sculptures I have seen and have loved, but I have remembered something about the time element and the circumnavigation of the work and the sense of wanting to touch, you know, is it cold, is it hot, is it smooth, is it right? All those sentient and sensory qualities have always been incredibly important, and that encounter I see as very like establishing a relationship. You know, it's the beginning of a relationship which is quite abstract and unformed in a way, and I suppose that's something I admire about sculpture. It's fearless in how it wants to make its presence felt to a viewer. So the viewer becomes psychologically and emotionally engaged from the off. And I think this is what this museum is for me.
Yes, and I think there's something else about it which is worth commenting on from your point of view as a sculptor, which is it's not just the fact that there's lots of sculptures spread about. It's about the fact they're spread about in this place, and therefore it's how sculptures affect the space they're in. If you took all this stuff out and put it somewhere else, it would be different, wouldn't it?
Exactly, yes, yeah. Therefore, I think this word, the encounter, not just of ourselves as warm-blooded creature meeting still, silent things, but in a very fanciful way, what is the object itself, if you like, in inverted commas, feeling? You know, what is its role in relationship to us? You know, and I know that's fanciful, but I often want to think about that. There is something extraordinary about extraordinarily unreal about this place, as though you are in a back-to-front world, you know. And as I was saying earlier, a lot of the things here are cast.
Yes,
So the
plaster cast, yeah.
Yes, plaster casts. So the original is somewhere else. So you've again got this other dislocation. You know? So I think for me, it's in the sense that sculpture is, to me, one of the most difficult, awkward, and at times hideous art mediums going. I think it is also one of the most sort of radical, in that it plays with theatre and theatricality.
Absolutely.
And I think this place does as well. I think John Soane must have had a great sense of the theatrical and the theatrical encounter, where his audience would be standing, where his viewer would be standing, and what the actual vista was. And, you know, how do you choose an object? I can't choose a single object from this. And therefore, for me, it is the whole experience. The object is the whole experience of being. Is
that what you're saying, Phyllida Barlow? So you're not choosing. This is like, I feel like I'm on Desert Island Discs, and you, as opposed to choosing one book, you've chosen the library. Yes. So you're saying you can't exactly. You can't choose a single object in the Soane. You are just choosing the Soane as an experience.
Yes, as an experience. And in a way, when you look at the facade of the houses that constitute the Soane Museum, you have no idea what this interior is. And to me, that is a very sculptural experience, you know, that you're entering. When you first encounter a sculpture, you may not know what's happening on the other side of it. And that walk around it is constantly revealing 360 degrees of different views of something. And this is what the interior of this building is for me, you know, constantly being woken up to a new view and a new passageway, a new way of looking down or looking up.
Yes.
And that to me is almost, despite all the objects that are there, they're almost at the periphery of my vision, and then suddenly something catches my attention.
So how do you tackle somewhere like the Soane? I mean, what do you let lead you through it? Are you looking for sight lines? Is it light? Is it a smell? Is it an object? What is it that helps you navigate a space like this?
I think it is the sight lines, and it is the difficulty in remembering where you've just come from, and then suddenly something catches my attention. One of the first things that really caught my attention here was 3 panels of, I think they're terracotta paving stones down, they're just through behind to the right of us there. And in a way, they're quite humble objects, but I thought they were absolutely staggeringly beautiful. Just these probably 30 centimetre square, 3 panels, glowing red, each one slightly different, each one worn from thousands of foot treads on them. So they carry that sense of touch with them right through to now, even though they're covered in glass. You're aware of how they've been.
Do you feel history? Do you feel history? Do you feel stories in the objects that you see?
Not necessarily stories, but just the incredible endeavour, the incredible human endeavour, and what we leave behind, and what that evidence is, and then what kinds of brutalities, like Palmyra being blown up and the Buddhas in Afghanistan being blown, you know, the way in which things cut both ways, these remarkable evidences of our past and who we are actually in the present. So you're having past and present meeting. And then the way these things represent something so powerful that they have to either be preserved, and conserved, or brutalized and destroyed.
Well, on that subject, Phyllida, I mean, what's your position around the current debate about the statues in Britain?
Yes, I think I can understand removing them from public places.
The ones which can be traced back to a sort of...
slavery or, but I think they should be kept in museums as historical records. I belong to that school of thought rather than totally destroying them, because I think we have to face up to our histories.
And that's a very live debate going on all around the world about where these objects in simple versions in universal museums, where they belong. Do they belong here, or do they belong from whence they came? What's your view?
I suppose idealistically it's incredible to have access to these objects and learn about as many different cultures and many different trajectories of human endeavour and ways of living. I think that's hugely important. I think one of the political tragedies that can happen, and we've experienced it here, is isolation, where you don't let the rest of the world in. So I think these objects serve that incredible purpose of informing us of, wonderful and terrifying acts of human behaviour. And but whether those objects, whether there couldn't be some way in which objects can be constantly travelling the world, I don't know.
Well, you mentioned, of course, that quite a lot of this collection plaster casts, so they are copies.
Yes.
That's an option, I suppose, with 3D printing nowadays.
Exactly.
One could create a copy of it for this country and then return to somewhere else, or vice versa. I mean, there can be that sort of fluidity and generosity.
Well, I think it brings us to something I was discussing earlier about the virtual world and the real world, and I almost feel there's a question, like with wildlife programs like television, having this sort of incredible gloss on them, where you see animals in their actual environments, and then you go to the zoo and stare at an empty cage because the animals are all asleep, or it's not their feeding time. Yeah. Has the skills of the virtual world created a kind of disappointment in reality, where maybe, unfortunately, I think the virtual world can show things in a way that the real world can't, and I think that's going to be an issue for museums, I feel, and maybe even for the visual arts as a whole.
Well, an issue for a sculptor, certainly, and a sculptor such as you, who works with a myriad of materials, and actually the whole point, in a way, strikes me, of your sculpture is it's all about the real world. It's about, to a certain extent, the vernacular. I've got a little quote here. There's a show of your work on Haus der Kunst, I think, in Munich. Yeah. And I looked on the webpage, and it's wonderful how it sort of introduces it. Have you read it? I'll read it. It says, with this major retrospective of the work of the British sculptor Phyllida Barlow, born 1944, Haus der Kunst 2021 opens a series of exhibitions in the museum's East Wing dedicated to contemporary female voices. That's you, Phyllida. Phyllida Barlow's sculptural structures are unwieldy and difficult to take in. Timber, cardboard, cement, clay, plastic pipes and colourful textiles pile up, spread out or block the visitor's way. The view ranges over these landscapes made of everyday materials, unsure what to hold on to, and drifts up to grasp their enormous dimensions. Barlow's work poses a constant challenge. They conquer the space as if they led a life of their own. They invite viewers to reconsider spaces, reconsider the perception of volume, and hear the language of architecture. Mm-hmm. So I suppose the question that begs from me is, we're in this amazing library at the Sir John Soane Museum, beautiful Georgian interior. What would you put in here? What Phyllida Barlow sculpture would you put in here?
I think I would do... I'll just tell a brief anecdote. I went to a collector's house in Mayfair, and there was just everything under the sun there, and she took me into the hallway, which was about this size, with a vast marble fireplace, incredible, and there was a Jeff Koons, and there was, you know, a Robert Motherwell and a Don Judd. You know, it was like kind of lucky dip of the 20th century, you know, incredible. And lots of younger artists as well. And this sounds really arrogant, but sitting on the fireplace right in the middle between two enormous brass candlesticks, candelabras, was this very small black sculpture just with a spray on it. And I went, oh, I like that. And she looked at me in absolute astonishment and she said, that's yours.
I'm glad you liked it.
Yes, exactly. And I think I would like to do something like that in here, something that would just nestle in amongst, say, the urns along the top, you know, a small object that was different, but maybe was proud of its difference.
How interesting, because that brings us on to sort of one of the main themes for a sculptor, one of the main problems as well, which is scale. So why that scale? Why a small scale for this space, but a massive scale, for example, the Devine's Gallery at Tate Britain?
Well, I think the Devine space is magnificent. And I think there were several critics who called me a vandal, you know, and all sorts of things which when you read those words, the sort of...
It's quite aggressive language.
Yes. You sort of feel ashamed, you know, and shocked. But I think it wasn't meant to be aggressive in that way. It was meant to be in a way...
No, I mean, their language was aggressive.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I hadn't meant the work to invite that kind of response. It was more, I'm going to make something that doesn't touch this architecture, but is in a way counteracting it, in order perhaps to respect it, you know. And so I put these very kind of rigid, square structures in the whole way down, and then hung...
Mainly wood, if I remember right.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Well done. And then hung sculptures off them with two things in mind. One was to integrate the audience into the work as much as possible. So there was nothing on the ground. I think there were two pieces that used the ground, but the idea was not to use the ground, but to, in a way, make everything be very airborne, and so that the audience would have the opportunity to maybe look up, through, across, as a total experience, and that perhaps, because it's a kind of avenue that you walk through, that maybe the works would be passed rather quickly, that they wouldn't be there to be contemplated. It would just be a total presence, very much in the way that I'm treating this building. Yes. And I think that then meant reaching right up into the vault of that space in order to create that, offer that dramatic theatrical experience, that it was the two works. It was the original building and then what had been, in a way, transplanted into that building.
So was part of your objective, so it's a huge Victorian gallery right in the middle of Tate Britain. You walk up the stairs, there it is, and it's enormous. Was part of your thinking to have people actually look up into that void, to look at that ceiling, which actually is very beautifully decorated. And also
to, in a way, the objects would be kind of controlling that movement of the audience. So they would perhaps be prompting that physical symbiosis with the objects that they were avoiding or moving around, with looking at the rest of the building. And I suppose in a way that's why I use space in that way, is it's a kind of adventure that I want to take the objects on. It's not necessarily being somebody who's like Richard Serra, who just wants the huge object.
Yes.
In fact, I'm not particularly interested in bigness in itself. I'm more interested in climbing into the spaces and allowing us, our physical selves, to in a way, go on that imaginative journey.
That's interesting. It's a bit like you were describing your relationship with coming in here, and you
Yes.
actually see it like the inside of a sculpture.
Yeah.
So what I think you're saying is sometimes the bigness of your work is a practical measure to ensure there is a void in which people can get into.
Exactly, absolutely. And also, you know, rather than it being on one's eye line, that one's whole physical body is engaged in some way. The walking through, the looking up, the walking round, you know, that it becomes, I always think with me there are three protagonists, you know, there's the space,
Yes.
then there's the sculpture, but then there's the audience.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
my kind of hope is that the three come together.
And when
in
you're
some way.
making, do you have an audience in mind?
No, when I'm making, it's quite a private experience, you know, where it's just doing battle with the work.
Yes.
And with these large works, there's always probably 4 other people involved as well. But with the smaller works, which is really the engine of the whole things, that's just me and the work, yeah. And
Yeah,
then
you're in a
lump of stuff.
well, a great big drill going into it. You're like a surgeon, you know. Well, I'm not a surgeon I want to be treated by, I have to say. But you know, I'm watching that process of yours, Phyllida, particularly when you're working with those smaller works, where you will create this sort of, I think it's reasonable to say, quite often quite a lumpen object, and it would be made of all sorts of different materials and sort of brought together with plaster and just, you know, sort of a great big mess of a pudding of a piece. But that's the beginning of its life.
Yes.
Because
yes.
then you really get, you drill into it, you throw it on the floor, you pull it apart, and it's quite extraordinary to watch. At what point do things start to resolve for you?
Well, I think I'm very much of the non-finito school of artists, where I don't know where things stop. And I think my whole relationship with that kind of pudding that you're talking about is actually trying to see whether the object will start to tell me where it wants to go. And in a way, that does happen, and that's a good moment when that begins to find itself. So there is this, a lot of the works can begin as images through drawings, and a lot of the works begin with just stuff, and in a way not knowing what on earth is going to happen. It's an unknown territory. And those are the ones that are often put through their most extreme paces to get to the other side of what it's meant to be. And when I start to use paint, I mean, when I've used paint since the 60s on sculpture, it was very much, it sort of served various functions, but it began to be a function where it was like the last action that happened. It was like closure. This can't go on any further. Originally, I started painting sculptures because I was intrigued by the sort of doppelganger that objects have. You can say, look at that door, or you can say, look at that brown door. Yeah. And I'm interested in what we kind of see first when it's a nameable thing. Do we see a door, or do we see the colour? And I think there are so many objects which play with that kind of trickery, but our brains are designed to create order out of that.
Yes.
You know? And I quite like the bit before that, which is fairly disorganized, where there's a state of unknownness about what something might be.
Which is the nature of existence, of course.
Yes, yes.
And with that in mind, I mean, I know there's nothing specific or pointed in that way about your work, but does it contain elements of metaphor and allegory?
Well, I've said it a million times. I never know what the subject of my work is, and that's what I love about this museum, because there is a psychological element here, I think. You know, I think Freud would have a field day. But I mean, what was in John Soane's mind? What was the psychology of these collections? And I think, for me, the actions of making are the subject. And they therefore do contain metaphor and allegory of maybe fragility and danger and the unknown, you know, all sorts of...
Or, for me, with your work, the word which screams out to me most when I see your work is chance.
Oh, that's nice, yes.
You know, because it's you couldn't do it again. You hadn't done it before.
You're absolutely right. I do get asked to repeat things and I can't, because I can't remember I can't repeat that action.
Because there's a certain element of improvisation about it, that you are in it and responding to it.
Yes, yeah. No, that's great, because I've not used the word chance, but it is the sort of chancing one's luck, and there's also other kinds of chances as well. But I think for me the word I've always used, two words actually. One is guessing, and the other is risk, you know. And I think guessing is a very underrated human quality, you know, whether you guess right or you guess wrong, you know, but there's something that's quite non-verbal about that in its original state. You know, do I go that way or that way? And there's nothing other than just guessing to tell you which way to go.
Fork in the road.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
The riddle, yeah.
So I'm interested to talk a bit about your career, because it's unusual in that you had this late career blossom, bloom. And why? Why did that happen? Obviously, you were very busy teaching, and obviously, I know you brought up a family, but other artists have done that too, and had a profile all the way through. Other female sculptors, I'm thinking about Barbara Hepworth. Although she didn't necessarily look after her children as much as you looked after yours, but you take the point. Why do you think it was that your work only started to get the sort of recognition it now has, really when you retired in 2009?
I've always kept going, and Fabian, my husband, and I, we were always incredibly sort of disciplined with the children growing up. And there were tough times, you know, the 80s was with a young family and no secure teaching at that time.
Five children.
5 children, yes, it was tough. And it may be very boring to say this, but I would, Fabian would have the mornings and I would have the afternoons, and we just stuck to that rigidly. And I think it ingrained in both of us that it didn't matter whether you were exhibiting or not, or it was a kind of necessity to keep going, because...
To make.
Yes, yeah, and it was the things that we would both set out to do, you know, early on, and we weren't going to let go of it. And even though it wasn't bearing any fruits, there was a kind of steely determination to be an artist, you know, and hold on to that.
And that's what you were, even when you were teaching at the Slade, and you were teaching some fabulous people. I think you taught Douglas Gordon, Tacita Dean.
Yeah, I always say I didn't teach them. Had lovely conversations with them on the stairs and that kind of thing. But I mean, they were sort of too good to be taught, if you know what I mean, especially Tacita, you know, remarkable.
Well, maybe the learning went both ways.
Yes, exactly, yes.
Yeah. But even then, in your mind's eye, in the way you thought of yourself, you were an artist, not an art teacher.
Yes, I mean, I've never had that problem. I always felt hugely privileged to be teaching in art schools. And teaching in art schools is an astonishing thing when it's going well. It's an oral tradition. Yeah. Nothing of what I did as a teacher remains in any form whatsoever. And that goes for all art schools, so it's ephemeral.
And it goes back hundreds of years.
Absolutely, hundreds of years. And I think in that way, there's a kind of freedom in how art schools offer education that is philosophical, it's speculative, it's about imagination, and it's about feeling and psychology. So it's about all the things that governments just want to stamp out and eradicate, you know. And so in that way, they are these warehouses of just extraordinary ideas and thoughts. And
yes, the intangible.
yes, and the teaching of all the great skills of how you stretch a canvas, you know, what you should do with oil paint or casting and things. Yes. They unfortunately have sort of diminished rather. And I suppose I'm old school in that respect. I wish there was some kind of basic skills programs in art schools. I think there are huge amounts of digital stuff. And I think various institutions are setting up making laboratories now. So I think it is returning in a very, very new way, you know, the whole issue around crafts and skills. Sorry, is this getting very boring?
No, I was talking to one very well-known painter who is mid-career, so 40s, who trained at the RA, and she felt like you that sort of that element of so not a classical education, but certainly an education which was steeped in understanding the processes of making and making was very important to her work. And so she worked in the life room, and there was nobody else in there. It was one of all these great facilities, and nobody really there. So it was marvelous. So that point that the education's moved away from, but actually a lot of artists still want to work in what one might talk about an old-fashioned way.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Slade had this phenomenal life room that was like, I mean, for me, I hated it. It was like a sort of religious, silent place. You know, it was the old kind of Ewan Uglow and Euston Road one. Yes. It was just extraordinary, and I think it was excellent that it was there, and that these counter traditions are set up against each other and create these friction rather than being a didactic sort of progressive system.
Sort of a linear.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So what happened, Phyllida? What happened in your mid-60s?
Yeah, what did happen?
Suddenly, you burst onto the scene. What precipitated it?
Well, I think the Serpentine, Hans Ulrich Obrist and Julia Peyton-Jones, for some reason, went to a few exhibitions I was having in 2009-10.
Yeah, so just as you were retiring from the Slade.
Yes, yeah. But I'd always exhibited throughout that time, but in strange, off the beaten track places. But they tracked one down, and she rang up one day and just said they wanted to do a studio visit. And I've had disastrous studio visits, just where people come in and they do that thing that I think ought to be forbidden when people do studio visits. They sort of look at my sink in my studio and go, "Oh my God, isn't that amazing?" Meanwhile, the studio is full of work.
It's an old Butler sink, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
But they came, and it was great. And then the next thing they did the next day was rang up and said, "We want you to show in April next year," which I think was 4 months away. Yeah. And so I did, and then Hauser and Wirth went to that show, and then they came and did a visit, which I think was also hilarious, because I think, I work in this very, very narrow studio at home, and I think they had not expected that sort of artist, who's just stayed in one place and made the work, and it's just piled up around them. I mean, I suppose it looked, in a way, eccentric, old-fashioned, and precarious in some way. But they said, would I like them to represent them? So I just said yes.
It's like having a great publisher, isn't it?
Yes.
It gives you an opportunity you would otherwise not have.
But it always makes me have a very moral attitude that if you want to write a book and it never gets published, you should still be incredibly proud that you've written that book. And I think that goes for all the arts.
Yes.
You know, just because something's exhibited doesn't mean that it's the greatest thing on earth.
No, better or worse than anything else necessarily.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That when I go into the studio, it's exactly the same as every other artist going into the studio.
Yes, I do know. Yeah. Because you've, as you described, the way you were discovered, so to speak, although you'd been around for ages, but suddenly put on this international platform and seen around the world, and suddenly all these rich collectors who live in Mayfair are buying your work. There's an element of luck to all that. You know, a studio visit, one person saw it, and one thing leads to another.
Yes. But also, it could all end tomorrow. Yeah. And I'm really grateful for the graft, because that doesn't scare me, you know, and I don't feel I've got to hang on to something. I feel there's enough there to sustain me, whatever the circumstances.
Yes, you had the ballast.
Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah.
So how did it feel, or what was your response when you were invited to represent Britain at the Venice Biennale in 2017?
Sort of shock, because it was right in the middle of Brexit. And I think my initial thought was, what am I representing, you know, and how do I...
What is Great Britain?
Exactly. Does it actually exist? Or so that was, and then I think I began to think about the little pavilion, and that it was like a folly, you know, a little post-colonial folly, and that became the title of the work, and it blended in very well with all sorts of notions I have about sculpture, which we see here, you know, the folly of something being a cast, so there's an original somewhere else, you know, these games that the sculptural object can play at pretending to be something when it isn't, you know, and I love that about it. I love that theatrical side of it. So that very much started to take over with the Venice work.
We can't finish this conversation without discussing briefly materials. Because, you know, when people used to think about sculpture, they used to think about people carving wood or carving stone or carving marble. And then I suppose, I mean, you know much more about this than I do, but, you know, you think about people like David Smith maybe coming in America in the 50s, and I suppose you could argue Duchamp earlier than that, when sort of what could be art changed. You know, art was allowed to be almost anything, and it could be made from pretty much anything. You know, and Tony Caro then picked up on those sort of ideas over in the UK. But your materials are such a fundamental part of your work, not just for me because of the objects you create with them, but the process of selection.
Well, I mean, I think I work in an incredibly traditional way. I think if I said, you know, yes, it's all very unique, other sculptors would just laugh me out of town. It's not. And I think, you know, you think of Arte Povera, which really changed all sorts of aspects of sculptural language, from using steam through to neon, you name it, to...
Old rags.
Yes, exactly. And that had a huge impact on me, you know, that I think the origins of everything with me is clay, I'm modelling with clay. So anything that can be crushed or pushed or pulled is what I like. And on the whole, quite honestly, I'm not that interested in materials. I'm interested in actions and being able to get materials that will do actions, like all the plasters, all the powder to liquid materials are great, and all the sheet materials like fabrics, paper, etc. They're all have this kind of inherent versatility about them. And that's really my relationship with material. I'm not a great researcher who wants to find the latest plastics or materials that are coming in chemically or anything like that. I'm not interested in spending days trying to find some very special kind of aesthetic look. I just want to be able to use materials that will do the job in hand, if that makes any sense.
Yes, and what is the job in hand? What are you making?
I think I'm making a kind of evidence of maybe a moment or a thought or perhaps something I've caught sight of that I want to replicate, but I'm interested in the journey it might go on through that process of replication.
So back to chance again.
Yes, chance.
Yes.
And evidence. I'm interested in how we evidence ourselves on this world.
Yes. So you.
What remains?
Well, indeed. So you make these works out of plaster. Might be string, might be fabric. Lots of wood, and it's the way you construct the pieces has a fragility to it because they look like they might collapse. Or maybe they look like they're just emerging. It could be either way. There's a formality to them and an informality to them. In your own mind, are they objects of regeneration or degeneration?
They're both. It's that cycle that I am interested in. Something that's fugitive and you're uncertain about whether it's coming or going. And I think that's exactly that. Reparation, regeneration, and in a way, destruction. The way they all combine, not only from a human point of view, but from the point of view of nature as well. Yes. So everything is in that state of either being at its most perfect or on either side of that.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to your work in the Soane Museum, Phyllida, up between those pots. Yes. But for now, we should stop. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful guest. We've explored a lot of territory in a short amount of time.
Thank you.
We look forward to your next show in Britain. When's your next show in the UK?
It's in Highgate Cemetery.
How appropriate. Thank you very much, Phyllida Barlow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the talk, it would be great if you would consider making a contribution which would enable us to continue our wider educational programs, and you can do so on soane.org. We appreciate your support and look forward to welcoming you back to the Soane again soon.